Good evening. Tonight, we descend into one of humanity's most terrifying chapters, where fear became law, superstition became truth, and innocent blood flowed like rivers through the streets of medieval Europe. This is the story of the witch hunts, a nightmare that consumed entire communities, destroyed countless lives, and revealed the darkest depths of human cruelty. Over the next hour, we will uncover how religious zealotry, political manipulation, and mass hysteria created a perfect storm of persecution that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives across centuries. We will witness the torture chambers, the rigged trials, the burning stakes, and the screams that echoed through villages where neighbors turned against neighbors, where children accused their own parents, and where the mere whisper of witch could seal a death sentence. Before we venture deeper into this darkness, I want you to do something that connects you to this haunting tale. Leave a comment below telling us from which corner of the world you are watching this, and what time it is where you are. You see, during the witch hunts, the very hour you walked outside, the shadows you cast, even the time you chose to light a candle could mark you as suspicious. Night belonged to the devil, they believed, and those who moved within it were his servants. And while you're here, subscribe to this channel, because we don't just tell stories about history. We excavate its buried horrors and shine light into the shadows where truth has been hidden. These are the stories that power once forgotten, the lessons that could save us from repeating humanity's greatest mistakes. The year is 1484. Pope Innocent VIII has just issued the Summus Desiderantis Effectibus, a papal bull that would unleash hell on earth. With the stroke of a quill, he has given divine sanction to hunt down, torture, and execute those suspected of witchcraft. But this moment did not arise from nothing. It was the culmination of centuries of fear, superstition, and the systematic demonization of women, healers, and anyone who dared to live outside society's rigid boundaries. To understand the brutality of the witch hunts, we must first understand the world that created them. Medieval Europe was a powder keg of anxieties. The Black Death had swept through the continent like the angel of death himself, killing 1/3 of the population. Famines ravaged communities. Wars raged endlessly. The Catholic Church, once the unquestioned authority, faced challenges from reformers and heretics. In this atmosphere of chaos and uncertainty, people desperately sought someone to blame, someone to punish for their suffering. Enter the witch, not the green-skinned hag of fairy tales, but your neighbor, your midwife, your healer, your widow down the lane who lived alone with her cats. The witch became the perfect scapegoat, a vessel for every fear, every unexplained tragedy, every stroke of bad luck that befell a community. The Church had long wrestled with the concept of magic and supernatural power. Early Christian doctrine actually denied the existence of witches, considering such beliefs to be pagan superstition. The Canon Episcopi, written in the 10th century, explicitly stated that those who believed in the reality of witchcraft were deceived by the devil. But as the medieval period progressed, this stance began to shift dramatically. Thomas Aquinas, the influential 13th century theologian, provided the intellectual framework that would later justify the witch hunts. He argued that demons were real, that they could interact with the physical world, and that humans could form pacts with these evil entities. This theological evolution was crucial because it gave scholarly and religious legitimacy to what had previously been considered mere folk belief. The transition from skepticism to acceptance of witchcraft as a real threat was gradual but inexorable. By the 15th century, the Church had fully embraced the idea that witches posed a genuine danger to Christian society. This shift was not merely theological, it was deeply political. The Church was losing its monopoly on spiritual authority, and the witch hunts provided a powerful tool to reassert control over increasingly restless populations. The most devastating text of this era was the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, written by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger in 1487. This manual for witch hunters would become one of the most influential and deadly books ever written. It provided detailed instructions on how to identify, torture, and execute witches, and it did so with the full authority of the Church behind it. The Malleus Maleficarum was particularly vicious in its treatment of women, arguing that they were more susceptible to demonic influence due to their supposedly weaker nature and greater carnality. All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable, the authors wrote, establishing a misogynistic foundation that would color centuries of persecution. But the witch hunts were not solely a product of religious fanaticism. They were also deeply economic and political phenomena. In a world where resources were scarce and social mobility was limited, accusations of witchcraft became weapons in local power struggles. A wealthy widow's property could be seized after her execution. A healer whose remedies competed with church-sanctioned practices could be eliminated. A woman who spoke too boldly in public could be silenced forever. The legal framework that enabled the witch hunts was equally crucial. The introduction of inquisitorial procedure, where judges actively sought evidence rather than merely evaluating what was presented, created an environment where accusations could multiply rapidly. The use of torture to extract confessions ensured that almost anyone could be made to admit to witchcraft, given sufficient pain and desperation. The geography of fear also played a crucial role. Witch hunts were not evenly distributed across Europe. They were most intense in regions experiencing political instability, religious conflict, or economic hardship. The Holy Roman Empire, fragmented into countless competing jurisdictions, became a particular hotbed of persecution. Local authorities, seeking to demonstrate their piety and competence, competed to root out witches in their territories. As we examine this dark foundation, we begin to see how the witch hunts were not the product of medieval ignorance alone, but rather a sophisticated system of oppression that served multiple masters. The Church gained religious authority, local rulers gained political control, and communities gained scapegoats for their suffering. The only losers were the innocent men, women, and children who would pay with their lives for this unholy alliance of fear and power. In the small German town of Wurzburg, a 7-year-old boy named Johannes Junius watches in horror as his mother is dragged from their home by church officials. Her crime. A neighbor claims she saw the woman speaking to her cat at midnight, clearly casting spells upon the livestock. Within hours, more accusations follow. The woman supposedly caused a cow to give sour milk, made a child fall ill with fever, and was seen dancing with devils in the forest under the full moon. This scene, repeated thousands of times across Europe, reveals the terrifying ease with which accusations could destroy lives. The architecture of accusation was built upon a foundation of paranoia, superstition, and deliberate manipulation that turned communities into hunting grounds for suspected witches. The process typically began with maleficium, the belief that witches could cause harm through supernatural means. When crops failed, animals died, children fell sick, or storms destroyed harvests, communities sought explanations that went beyond natural causes. In a world where scientific understanding was limited, supernatural explanations filled the void. If old Margaret looked at your cow with an evil eye just before it died, clearly she had cursed it. If young Maria rejected a man's advances and he subsequently fell ill, obviously she had hexed him out of spite. But individual accusations were just the beginning. The real horror lay in how these allegations spread and multiplied through communities like a plague. The legal procedures established by the Church and secular authorities actively encouraged the expansion of accusations. Torture was not merely used to extract confessions. It was used to force the accused to name accomplices, creating an ever-widening circle of suspected witches. The torture methods employed were specifically designed to break both body and spirit. The strapado involved tying the victim's hands behind their back and hoisting them into the air by their wrists, often with weights attached to their feet. The agony was indescribable, and few could endure it without confessing to whatever their interrogators demanded. The thumbscrews slowly crushed fingers and thumbs, while leg screws did the same to shins and calves. Water torture involved forcing massive quantities of water down the victim's throat until they felt they were drowning from within. Sleep deprivation was another favored technique. Suspects were kept awake for days or even weeks, as interrogators worked in shifts to maintain constant pressure. Hallucinations and delirium inevitably followed, making victims more susceptible to suggestion and more likely to confess to impossible crimes. Perhaps most insidiously, the legal system was rigged to ensure conviction. The accusers were often granted anonymity, making it impossible for the accused to confront their accusers. Hearsay evidence was not only accepted but actively encouraged. The testimony of supposed accomplices, extracted under torture, was given equal weight to that of credible witnesses, and the burden of proof was effectively reversed. Rather than proving guilt, authorities demanded that the accused prove their innocence, an impossible task when the crime was supernatural in nature. The Malleus Maleficarum provided detailed guidance on how to identify witches through physical examination. Witch hunters searched for devil's marks, unusual moles, birthmarks, or scars that supposedly showed where demons had touched or suckled the accused. These marks were tested by pricking them with needles. If they didn't bleed or cause pain, they were considered proof of demonic pacts. Professional witch hunters carried specially designed needles that could retract into their handles, ensuring that no mark would bleed when tested. Water ordeals represented another grotesque perversion of justice. Accused witches were bound and thrown into deep water. If they floated, it proved their guilt, as water supposedly rejected those in league with the devil. If they sank and drowned, they were posthumously declared innocent. It was a test designed to be impossible to survive. The confession process was equally corrupt. Interrogators had detailed knowledge of what constitutes a proper confession of witchcraft, and they guided torture sessions to produce exactly the admissions they needed. Victims were forced to describe their attendance at sabbats, their sexual relations with demons, their methods of causing harm to neighbors, and their recruitment of other witches. These confessions followed remarkably similar patterns across different regions and time periods, not because they reflected genuine experiences, but because they reflected the interrogator's expectations and leading questions. Children proved particularly vulnerable to both accusation and manipulation. Young accusers were seen as pure vessels, incapable of deception, making their testimony especially damaging. Simultaneously, children of accused witches often found themselves targeted, as witchcraft was believed to run in families. The psychological trauma of watching their parents tortured and executed frequently drove children to make their own confessions, either to escape similar treatment or because they genuinely believed they might possess supernatural powers. The economic incentives that drove accusations cannot be ignored. Witch hunting was a profitable business. Professional witch hunters charged fees for their services, often taking a percentage of the condemned's property as payment. Court officials, torturers, executioners, and even the suppliers of wood for burning stakes all profited from the proceedings. The property of convicted witches was typically confiscated, providing additional revenue for local authorities. Women faced particular vulnerability in this system of accusation. They comprised roughly 80% of those executed for witchcraft, reflecting deep-seated misogynistic beliefs about female susceptibility to demonic influence. Widows were especially targeted, as they often controlled property without male protection and lived outside traditional family structures that provided some social shield. Midwives and healers faced accusations because their knowledge of herbs and birthing practices was viewed with suspicion in an era when such skills were increasingly seen as potentially diabolical. The seasonal nature of accusations reveals additional patterns of manipulation. Accusations often spiked during times of economic hardship, failed harvests, or disease outbreaks. Winter months, when communities were isolated and tensions ran high, frequently saw increased witch hunting activity. Religious holidays, particularly those associated with supposed demon worship, provided occasions for mass arrests and trials. As accusations multiplied within communities, a terrible psychology took hold. Neighbors who might have previously supported each other turned suspicious and hostile. The mere act of defending an accused which could itself draw suspicion. Silence became complicity, and complicity became evidence of guilt. Entire towns could become consumed by paranoia, where every glance, every whispered conversation, every unexplained misfortune became potential evidence of supernatural malevolence. The geography of accusation also reveals deliberate patterns. Witch hunts were most intense in border regions where competing authorities sought to demonstrate their religious orthodoxy and political control. Areas experiencing rapid social change, whether due to economic development or religious reform, were particularly susceptible to outbreaks of persecution. The fragmented political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire provided ideal conditions for competing jurisdictions to engage in witch hunting as a form of political theater. The heavy wooden door creaks open in a castle dungeon in Bamberg, Germany. Prince Bishop Julius Ector von Mespelbrunn descends the stone steps, his ornate robes rustling against the cold walls. Before him lies a woman, barely recognizable as human after weeks of torture. Her name was Anna Schweglin, and she was once the respected wife of a prosperous merchant. Now she is accused of flying through the night sky to dance with Satan himself. This scene encapsulates the institutional machinery that transformed individual accusations into systematic mass murder. The Inquisition, originally established to combat heresy, evolved into the perfect instrument for conducting witch hunts on an unprecedented scale. What made these persecutions so devastatingly effective was not spontaneous mob violence, but rather the cold, calculated efficiency of religious and legal bureaucracy. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, initially focused on conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly maintaining their original faiths. However, as the institution matured, its scope expanded dramatically. Witchcraft became one of many offenses that fell under inquisitorial jurisdiction, and the procedures developed for religious persecution proved terrifyingly effective when applied to suspected witches. The Roman Inquisition, established in 1542, provided another model for systematic persecution. Unlike secular courts, inquisitorial tribunals operated under different rules of evidence and procedure. They could act on anonymous denunciations. They encouraged witnesses to come forward with rewards and promises of leniency, and they treated confession as the ultimate goal of their proceedings. These procedures, originally designed to combat heresy, proved devastatingly effective when applied to witchcraft accusations. The financial apparatus supporting the Inquisition reveals the economic motives that sustained these persecutions. Inquisitorial courts were largely self-funding through the confiscation of property from condemned heretics and witches. This created a perverse incentive system where the institution's survival depended on finding ever more victims to prosecute. The more successful an inquisitor was at uncovering witches, the more resources his court received to continue its work. Heinrich Kramer, author of the Malleus Maleficarum, exemplified the professional witch hunter who operated within this system. Appointed as Papal Inquisitor for Germany, Kramer conducted witch hunts throughout the German territories with ruthless efficiency. His methods were so extreme that even some church authorities began to question his practices. However, the success of his manual in providing systematic guidance for witch hunting ensured that his influence would outlast his personal career. The procedural innovations of the Inquisition revolutionized how witch hunts were conducted. Traditional accusatorial procedure required clear evidence and credible witnesses. Inquisitorial procedure, by contrast, empowered judges to actively investigate and build cases against suspects. This meant that vague suspicions or rumors could be transformed into formal accusations through systematic investigation. The doctrine of exceptional crimes provided legal justification for abandoning normal judicial safeguards when dealing with witchcraft. Since witchcraft was considered an exceptionally heinous offense that threatened the very foundations of Christian society, courts were authorized to use exceptional measures to combat it. This included the extensive use of torture, the acceptance of testimony from accomplices and criminals, and the relaxation of normal standards of evidence. The training and deployment of professional witch hunters created a cadre of specialists who moved from region to region, bringing their expertise in identifying and prosecuting witches. These men often possessed legal training and deep familiarity with demonological theory, making them formidable opponents for accused witches who typically lacked any legal representation or understanding of the proceedings against them. The Congregation of the Holy Office, established by Pope Paul III, provided central coordination for inquisitorial activities throughout Catholic Europe. This institutional framework allowed successful techniques and procedures to be shared between different regions, creating a standardized approach to witch hunting that maximized its effectiveness. Regular correspondence between inquisitors spread best practices for extracting confessions, identifying accomplices, and securing convictions. The integration of secular and ecclesiastical authorities created an unstoppable force for persecution. While church courts handled the religious aspects of witchcraft prosecution, secular authorities carried out the actual executions. This division of labor allowed each institution to claim that it was merely fulfilling its proper role while avoiding full responsibility for the bloodshed that resulted. The documentation produced by inquisitorial courts provides chilling insight into the systematic nature of these persecutions. Detailed records were kept of every aspect of the proceedings, from initial denunciations through final executions. These documents reveal how accusations were investigated, how torture was applied, how confessions were extracted, and how sentences were carried out. The bureaucratic precision of these records stands in stark contrast to the human suffering they document. The use of familiars, or assistants, allowed inquisitors to extend their reach throughout the communities they investigated. These local collaborators, often motivated by personal grudges or hopes of financial reward, provided the detailed knowledge of community dynamics that made persecution so effective. They identified potential targets, gathered gossip and rumors, and sometimes participated directly in the interrogation and torture of suspects. The psychological techniques employed by inquisitors were as sophisticated as their legal procedures. They understood how to exploit fear, guilt, and desperation to break down resistance and extract confessions. The isolation of suspects from family and community, the constant threat of torture, the promise of mercy in exchange for cooperation, and the gradual escalation of physical and psychological pressure created an environment where even the most innocent victims eventually succumbed. The seasonal rhythms of inquisitorial activity revealed the calculated nature of these persecutions. Many witch hunts were timed to coincide with periods of social tension or economic hardship, when communities were most receptive to explanations that blamed their problems on supernatural malevolence. The theatrical aspects of trials and executions were carefully staged to maximize their impact on local populations. The international network of communication between inquisitors ensured that successful techniques developed in one region quickly spread to others. Letters, reports, and manuals circulated throughout Catholic Europe, creating a shared body of knowledge about how to conduct effective witch hunts. This networking also allowed inquisitors to track suspected witches who might flee from one jurisdiction to another. The training programs established for inquisitors created a professional class of witch hunters who approached their work with scholarly precision. These men studied demonology, learned interrogation techniques, and mastered the legal procedures that made convictions possible. Their expertise lent an air of intellectual respectability to proceedings that were fundamentally based on superstition and fear. The legacy of inquisitorial innovation extended far beyond the specific period of witch hunts. The procedures developed for combating witchcraft influenced later forms of political persecution, from the prosecution of heretics to modern totalitarian show trials. The psychological techniques, legal innovations, and institutional structures pioneered during the witch hunts provided a template for systematic persecution that would be employed by authoritarian regimes for centuries to come. Marguerite Porete was a brilliant theologian whose mystical writings challenged church orthodoxy in 14th century France. For her intellectual independence, she was burned at the stake in 1310. Nearly 3 centuries later, another brilliant woman, Joan of Arc, met the same fate for daring to claim direct communication with God. These women, separated by time and circumstance, shared a common fate with hundreds of thousands of others, whose only crime was existing outside the narrow confines society had created for their gender. The witch hunts were, above all else, a war against women. While men certainly fell victim to accusations of witchcraft, women comprised roughly 80% of those executed, revealing the deeply gendered nature of these persecutions. To understand the brutal truth about witch hunts, we must confront the misogyny that drove them and the specific ways that female autonomy, knowledge, and power were criminalized and punished with death. The theological foundation for targeting women was laid out explicitly in the Malleus Maleficarum. Its authors argued that women were more susceptible to demonic temptation due to their supposedly weaker intellects, stronger carnal desires, and greater tendency toward deception. When a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil, they wrote, establishing a premise that any independent thought by women could be inherently dangerous. But the persecution of women as witches went far beyond abstract theological arguments. It served concrete social, economic, and political functions in a rapidly changing medieval world. As traditional feudal structures began to break down, women found themselves in increasingly precarious positions. Yet some also gained unprecedented opportunities for independence and influence. The witch hunts served as a violent corrective to these developments, reasserting male dominance through the most extreme means possible. Widows represented the largest single category of women accused of witchcraft, and this targeting was far from random. In medieval society, widowhood could paradoxically represent both extreme vulnerability and dangerous independence. Widows often controlled property, made their own economic decisions, and lived outside the protection and control of male relatives. This autonomy made them threatening to patriarchal social structures and attractive targets for those seeking to seize their property or silence their voices. The case of Alice Kytler, tried for witchcraft in Ireland in 1324, illustrates how widowhood could become a death sentence. Kytler had outlived 4 husbands and accumulated considerable wealth. When she was accused of murdering her husbands through witchcraft and poisoning, The charges clearly stemmed from resentment over her financial independence and multiple marriages, though she managed to escape execution by fleeing to England. Her servant Petronilla de Meath was burned in her place, demonstrating how class privilege could sometimes provide escape routes unavailable to poorer women. Midwives and healers faced particular scrutiny because their knowledge of herbs, anatomy, and medical procedures was viewed with suspicion in an era when such expertise was increasingly seen as potentially diabolical. These women possessed knowledge that was both valuable and threatening. They understood reproductive health, could ease pain during childbirth, and knew which plants could heal or harm. In a society where such knowledge was becoming medicalized and placed under male professional control, traditional female healers represented competition that needed to be eliminated. The persecution of midwives had devastating consequences for women's health and autonomy. As traditional female healers were eliminated or driven underground, women lost access to crucial reproductive health care and pain relief during childbirth. The very knowledge that had empowered women for centuries was redefined as demonic, forcing future generations to depend on male physicians who often lacked practical experience with women's health issues. Economic motives played a crucial role in targeting women for witchcraft accusations. In a society where women's economic opportunities were severely limited, successful female merchants, brewsters, or craftswomen could attract resentment and suspicion. If a woman prospered despite the obstacles placed in her path, supernatural assistance provided a convenient explanation. Her success could be attributed to demonic pacts rather than skill, intelligence, or hard work. The ale trade provides a perfect example of how economic persecution operated under the guise of witchcraft accusations. Brewing had traditionally been a female-dominated profession, with alewives controlling production and distribution in many communities. As male-dominated guilds sought to take over this lucrative trade, accusations of witchcraft proved an effective tool for eliminating female competition. The stereotype of the witch with her cauldron directly derived from the alewife with her brewing kettle, transforming a respectable profession into evidence of supernatural malevolence. Sexual autonomy represented another flashpoint for accusations. Women who rejected marriage proposals, engaged in extramarital relationships, or simply expressed sexual desires that challenged social norms could find themselves accused of consorting with demons. The witch stereotype included explicit sexual elements, with accused women forced to confess to intercourse with Satan himself. These confessions served to sexually humiliate victims, while reinforcing the idea that female sexuality was inherently dangerous and needed to be controlled. The age demographics of accused witches reveal additional patterns of targeting. While popular imagery focuses on elderly women, victims actually spanned all age groups, with a significant number being women in their childbearing years. Young women who displayed independence, intelligence, or nonconformity could attract suspicion, while older women who had accumulated property, knowledge, or influence became targets for different reasons. Single women faced particular vulnerability regardless of their age, whether they were unmarried daughters who remained in their parents' homes past the expected marriage age, or women who chose religious vocations, or simply women who preferred independence to marriage. Their unmarried status marked them as suspicious. In a society where women were expected to be under male authority throughout their lives, those who existed outside these structures appeared threatening and unnatural. The accusations made against women reveal the specific fears that female autonomy generated in medieval society. Women were accused of causing impotence in men, preventing conception, causing miscarriages, killing infants, souring milk, and destroying crops. These charges directly related to women's traditional roles in reproduction, nutrition, and agriculture, areas where their knowledge and influence were both essential and potentially threatening. The confessions extracted from accused women provide chilling insights into how female sexuality and autonomy were criminalized. Under torture, women were forced to describe sexual encounters with demons. Attendance at sabbats, where they supposedly danced naked and engaged in orgies, and the use of their bodies to create flying ointments and magical potions. These confessions served multiple purposes. They provided titillating entertainment for male authorities. They reinforced stereotypes about female carnality and deception, and they justified the extreme punishments inflicted on the accused. The impact of witch hunts on women's social position was profound and lasting. The constant threat of accusation forced women to carefully regulate their behavior, speech, and associations. Independence became dangerous, knowledge became suspect, and success became evidence of supernatural assistance. The witch hunts effectively terrorized women into conformity with restrictive gender roles by demonstrating the deadly consequences of stepping outside prescribed boundaries. The intergenerational trauma of witch hunts affected entire families and communities. Daughters watched their mothers burned at stakes. Wives saw their husbands turn against them under pressure, and sisters found themselves forced to testify against each other to save their own lives. The social fabric of women's relationships was torn apart by suspicion and fear, destroying the networks of mutual support that had traditionally sustained female communities. The religious dimensions of persecution targeted women's spiritual autonomy alongside their social and economic independence. Mystical experiences, direct religious visions, and claims to spiritual authority were reinterpreted as demonic possession or deception. Women like Marguerite Porete, who dared to write theological treatises or claim direct access to divine truth, represented a fundamental challenge to male religious authority that could not be tolerated. The geographical patterns of persecution reveal how local conditions affected women's vulnerability to accusations. Regions experiencing economic change, political instability, or religious conflict showed higher rates of witch persecution, particularly of women. Areas where traditional gender roles were being challenged by new economic opportunities or social developments became hotbeds of misogynistic violence disguised as religious duty. The screams echo from the basement of the Marienburg fortress in Würzburg as another suspected witch is subjected to the strappado. Her shoulders dislocate with audible pops as she is hoisted into the air by her arms, which are bound behind her back. Weights have been attached to her feet to increase the agony. This is only the beginning. If she does not confess to consorting with the devil, her tormentors have an arsenal of devices designed to break both body and spirit. The torture chambers of medieval Europe represent one of humanity's darkest achievements, the systematic development of techniques designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims alive long enough to extract confessions. These were not crude instruments wielded by sadistic individuals, but carefully designed tools employed by trained professionals within a legal framework that sanctioned and regulated their use. The legal doctrine behind judicial torture was based on the Roman law principle that confession was the queen of proofs. While other forms of evidence might be circumstantial or incomplete, a confession provided absolute certainty of guilt. For witch hunters, this principle became a cornerstone of their practice, justifying almost any level of physical coercion to achieve the desired admissions. The Malleus Maleficarum provided detailed guidance on the proper application of torture in witchcraft cases. It specified that torture should be applied gradually, beginning with threats and intimidation before progressing to actual physical pain. The manual emphasized that the goal was not simply punishment, but rather the extraction of complete and detailed confessions that would implicate other witches and justify the accused execution. The strappado, also known as the Queen of Torments, was perhaps the most commonly used device. Victims were suspended from the ceiling by ropes attached to their wrists, which were bound behind their backs. The initial drop would dislocate both shoulders, causing excruciating pain. Weights could be added to the ankles to increase the agony, and the victim could be repeatedly raised and dropped to maximize suffering. Most people could not endure this torture for more than a few minutes without begging to confess. The rack represented the pinnacle of mechanical torture design. Victims were strapped to a wooden frame and slowly stretched as rollers at each end were turned by levers. The process began with uncomfortable tension, but gradually progressed to the dislocation of joints and the tearing of ligaments and muscles. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical pain, as victims could see exactly what was happening to their bodies and anticipate each escalation of agony. Water torture took several forms, each designed to create the sensation of drowning without actually causing death. In one variant, victims were strapped to inclined boards with their heads lower than their feet. Cloth was placed over their faces and water was slowly poured over it, creating the sensation of suffocating. Another method involved forcing massive quantities of water down the victim's throat until their stomach was painfully distended. The psychological terror of feeling like one was drowning from within often proved as effective as the physical discomfort. The thumb screws and leg screws represented precision instruments designed to crush specific body parts. These devices slowly compressed thumbs, fingers, toes, or shins between metal plates that could be gradually tightened. The pain was indescribable, and the crushing was often permanent, leaving victims crippled even if they survived their ordeal. The psychological impact of watching one's own body, parts being methodically destroyed, was often enough to break even the strongest will. Sleep deprivation was employed as a form of torture that left no visible marks, but could be devastatingly effective. Suspects were kept awake for days or even weeks, with guards working in shifts to ensure constant vigilance. As exhaustion mounted, victims became increasingly susceptible to suggestion and hallucination. Many began to genuinely believe they had committed the crimes they were accused of, their grip on reality shattered by prolonged sleeplessness. The heated metal torture devices represented some of the most sadistic innovations of medieval torturers. Iron boots could be heated and placed on victims' feet, slowly cooking the flesh. Heated metal brands were applied to various parts of the body, creating permanent scars and agonizing pain. Some torturers used heated metal implements to burn specific body parts, such as the genitals, adding sexual humiliation to physical agony. The psychological techniques employed alongside physical torture were equally sophisticated and destructive. Victims were often forced to watch others being tortured, breaking down their mental defenses before their own ordeals began. Family members were sometimes tortured in front of each other, with parents forced to choose between their own suffering and that of their children. False hopes and promises were systematically employed to manipulate victims. Torturers would offer mercy in exchange for confessions, promising that cooperation would lead to leniency or even freedom. These promises were typically lies, as confession almost invariably led to execution, but they provided powerful psychological leverage during torture sessions. The confession process itself was carefully choreographed to extract maximum information while ensuring legal validity. Victims were required to provide specific details about their supposed crimes, including dates, locations, accomplices, and methods. If their initial confessions were deemed insufficient, torture would be resumed until they provided the level of detail their interrogators demanded. The role of professional torturers reveals the bureaucratic nature of these proceedings. These were not random acts of violence, but systematic procedures carried out by trained specialists. Torturers learned anatomy to maximize pain while minimizing the risk of premature death. They understood psychology well enough to break victims' will to resist. They were often well compensated for their expertise, receiving payment not just for their time, but for their specialized knowledge. The medical professionals who sometimes assisted in torture sessions represent one of the most disturbing aspects of these proceedings. Physicians would monitor victims' vital signs to ensure they remained conscious and capable of confessing. They would provide treatments to keep victims alive between torture sessions, healing wounds just enough to allow continued interrogation. This medical participation lent an air of scientific legitimacy to what were fundamentally barbaric proceedings. The documentation of torture sessions reveals the meticulous record-keeping that characterized these legal proceedings. Detailed accounts were kept of what torture methods were used, how long they were applied, what confessions were extracted, and what physical condition victims were left in. These records served legal purposes, providing evidence that proper procedures had been followed. But they also revealed the cold, bureaucratic mindset that made systematic torture possible. The seasonal patterns of torture reveal how external factors influenced these proceedings. Winter months, when communities were isolated and resources were scarce, often saw intensified torture sessions. The long, dark nights provided cover for activities that authorities preferred to keep hidden from casual observers. The psychological impact of prolonged darkness and cold added to the despair and hopelessness that torturers sought to create in their victims. The impact on families and communities was devastating and long-lasting. Children who witnessed their parents being dragged away for torture often suffered lifelong psychological trauma. Spouses were forced to choose between protecting their partners and protecting themselves and their children. The social bonds that held communities together were systematically destroyed by the fear and suspicion that surrounded torture chambers. The economic aspects of torture chambers reveal another dimension of their systematic nature. These facilities required significant investment in equipment, trained personnel, and secure locations. The cost was typically borne by the communities where witch hunts occurred, creating a financial incentive to find enough witches to justify the expense. The property confiscated from convicted witches often helped offset these costs, creating a perverse economic logic that sustained the persecution. The architectural design of torture chambers was carefully planned to maximize psychological impact while maintaining operational efficiency. Victims were often held in cramped, dark cells before their sessions, increasing their anxiety and disorientation. The torture chambers themselves were designed to amplify sounds, ensuring that the screams of current victims could be heard by those awaiting their turn. The proximity of execution sites to torture chambers served as a constant reminder of the likely outcome of these proceedings. The international exchange of torture techniques and equipment reveals the cosmopolitan nature of these supposedly local proceedings. Innovations developed in one region quickly spread to others, through correspondence between inquisitors and the circulation of technical manuals. The witch hunts were not isolated local phenomena, but part of a coordinated European-wide campaign of persecution that shared methods, personnel, and expertise across national boundaries. On a cold February morning in 1431, 19-year-old Joan of Arc was led to her execution in the market square of Rouen. The charges against her were heresy and witchcraft, her crime being the audacity to claim direct communication with saints and angels. As the flames consumed her body, she cried out the name of Jesus 6 times before dying. But Joan's case, while the most famous, was merely one star in a constellation of horror that stretched across Europe for centuries. The case of the Pendle witches in Lancashire, England, in 1612, demonstrates how family feuds and local politics could explode into mass persecution. The trouble began with a rivalry between two families, the Demdikes and the Chattoxes, both headed by elderly women who practiced folk healing and were rumoured to possess supernatural powers. When Olizan de Vyse, granddaughter of old Demdike, was refused pins by a peddler and subsequently cursed him, causing him to suffer what appeared to be a stroke. The accusation spiral began. What made the Pendle case particularly devastating was how it pit family members against each other. Jeanette Devise, only 9 years old, testified against her own mother, brother, and sister, condemning them to death with her testimony. Her testimony was considered especially credible precisely because of her youth and apparent innocence. The authorities believed children were incapable of the deception they attributed to adult witches, making young accusers particularly dangerous witnesses. The trial records from Pendle revealed the economic motivations behind many accusations. The Devise and Chattox families were among the poorest in their community, surviving through begging, petty theft, and their reputations as cunning folk who could provide charms and curses for payment. When hard times struck the region, these families became convenient scapegoats for the community's economic struggles. In Germany, the case of Julius Ector von Mespelbrunn, Prince Bishop of Wurzburg, reveals how witch hunts could be systematically employed as tools of political control and personal enrichment. Between 1626 and 1631, Ector orchestrated the execution of approximately 1,000 people for witchcraft, including his own nephew, several clergy members, and numerous children as young as 7 years old. Ector's witch hunts followed a clear pattern of political calculation. He targeted wealthy families whose property he could confiscate, rival nobles who challenged his authority, and anyone who questioned his increasingly tyrannical rule. The theological justification was merely a veneer covering systematic pillage and political murder. His victims included a 7-year-old girl who was accused of having sexual relations with the devil, demonstrating the complete abandonment of reason and compassion that characterized his reign of terror. The economic records from Wurzburg during this period revealed the true scope of Ector's campaign. The confiscated property from condemned witches funded massive building projects, including the construction of the Marienburg fortress and numerous churches. The witch hunts were, in effect, a systematic program of wealth redistribution from Ector's perceived enemies to his own coffers and those of his supporters. In France, the case of Martha Brossier in 1598 illustrates how accusations of demonic possession could be used to attack religious and political opponents. Brossier, a teenage girl, claimed to be possessed by devils and accused several people of causing her condition through witchcraft. Her case became a sensation that attracted attention from the highest levels of French society, including King Henry IV himself. What made the Brossier case particularly significant was how it became entangled with religious politics during the French Wars of Religion. Her accusations primarily targeted Catholic clergy and nobles, making her a useful tool for Protestant propagandists seeking to discredit their religious opponents. The case eventually collapsed when medical examinations revealed that her supposed supernatural symptoms could be reproduced through natural means, but not before several innocent people had been executed based on her testimony. The Salem witch trials of 1692 in Massachusetts represent perhaps the most famous outbreak of witch persecution in the English-speaking world. Though they occurred relatively late in the historical timeline of European witch hunts, the Salem cases began when several young girls, including 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, began exhibiting strange behaviors that were interpreted as signs of bewitchment. What made Salem particularly devastating was how quickly accusations spread throughout the community and beyond. Within months, accusations had reached some of the most respectable members of colonial society, including former ministers, wealthy merchants, and even the wife of the governor. The cases revealed deep social tensions within Puritan communities, including conflicts between traditional agricultural families and newer mercantile interests, disputes over land ownership, and struggles between different religious factions. The role of Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados who served in the Parris household, demonstrates how racial and social marginalization made certain individuals particularly vulnerable to accusations. Tituba's initial confession, which included vivid descriptions of meetings with the devil and flights through the air, provided the template for subsequent confessions and helped establish the narrative framework that would dominate the Salem trials. The economic dimensions of the Salem cases mirror patterns seen throughout European witch hunts. Many of the accused were property owners whose estates would be confiscated upon conviction. The costs of imprisonment, trial, and execution were charged to the families of the accused, creating additional economic incentives for prosecution. Even victims who were eventually acquitted often found themselves financially ruined by the legal costs they had incurred. In Scotland, the case of the North Berwick witches in 1590-1591 demonstrates how witch hunts could be manipulated for high-level political purposes. The case began with accusations against several women in the fishing village of North Berwick, but it quickly expanded to include claims of a vast conspiracy to assassinate King James VI through supernatural means. The political context of the North Berwick cases was crucial to their development. King James had recently married Anne of Denmark, and their return voyage to Scotland had been delayed by severe storms. When one of the accused witches confessed under torture to raising these storms through magic, the case transformed from a local persecution into a matter of national security. The interrogation techniques used in the North Berwick cases were particularly brutal, even by the standards of the era. Victims were subjected to sleep deprivation, crushing of limbs, and the application of heated metal implements to their bodies. The detailed confessions extracted through these tortures provided the narrative foundation for one of the largest witch persecution campaigns in Scottish history. King James's personal involvement in the North Berwick cases had lasting consequences for witch persecution throughout Britain. His experience as an interrogator and his conviction that witches posed a genuine threat to royal authority led him to write his treatise Demonology, which provided intellectual justification for continued persecution. When James became King of England in 1603, he brought his witch-hunting zeal with him, contributing to the continued persecution of suspected witches throughout Britain. The case of Anna Gueldi, executed in Switzerland in 1782, represents one of the last legal executions for witchcraft in Europe, demonstrating how these persecutions persisted even into the Age of Enlightenment. Gueldi, a domestic servant, was accused of bewitching her employer's daughter after the child began finding pins in her food and exhibiting strange behaviors. The political and social context of Gueldi's case reveals how witch accusations could serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Her employer, Johann Jacob Tschudi, was a wealthy magistrate and physician who had been having an affair with Gueldi when she became inconvenient. The witchcraft accusation provided a convenient way to eliminate her while deflecting attention from his own improper behavior. The legal proceedings against Gueldi followed many of the same patterns established centuries earlier during the height of the witch hunts. She was subjected to torture to extract a confession, denied adequate legal representation, and condemned based on evidence that would not have been accepted in other types of criminal cases. Her execution demonstrated how the legal and social structures that enabled witch persecution could persist long after the intellectual justifications for such prosecutions had been abandoned by educated elites. The international attention that Gueldi's case attracted reveals how attitudes toward witch persecution had changed by the late 18th century. Enlightenment intellectuals throughout Europe condemned her execution as a barbaric relic of medieval superstition, and her case became a rallying point for critics of traditional religious authority and judicial corruption. The case of the Wurzburg witch hunts under Prince Bishop Julius Ector deserves additional examination for its systematic nature and devastating scope. Between 1626 and 1631, Ector's campaign resulted in approximately 1,000 executions, making it one of the most intensive periods of witch persecution in European history. The victims included people from all levels of society, from peasants to nobles, children to elderly adults, clergy to laypeople. The documentation from Wurzburg provides extraordinary insight into the administrative machinery that made mass persecution possible. Detailed records were kept of every aspect of the process, from initial accusations through final executions. These documents reveal how accusations were investigated, how torture was applied, how confessions were extracted, and how sentences were carried out. The economic impact of the Wurzburg persecutions was staggering. The confiscated property from condemned witches funded massive construction projects throughout the Principality. Churches, fortifications, palaces, and public works were built with wealth stolen from the families of executed victims. The witch hunts essentially served as a massive program of forced taxation, with death as the penalty for non-compliance. The social impact was equally devastating. Entire families were wiped out, noble lineages were extinguished, and communities were torn apart by suspicion and fear. The demographic impact was so severe that some villages lost significant portions of their populations, and the economic disruption lasted for decades after the persecutions ended. These famous cases reveal common patterns that characterized witch hunts throughout Europe. Personal grudges were transformed into supernatural accusations. Economic motives were disguised as religious duty. Political conflicts were fought using charges of witchcraft, and social tensions were resolved through the elimination of inconvenient individuals. The victims, regardless of their social status or personal circumstances, shared the common fate of being sacrificed to the fears, ambitions, and hatreds of their communities. In the ledger books of Bamberg, careful entries record the costs of executing suspected witches: 20 florins for the executioner, 15 for the wood, 10 for the tar, 5 for the rope. Each line item represents not just a financial transaction, but a human life reduced to a commodity in a grotesque marketplace of death. The witch hunts were not merely religious or social phenomena. They were elaborate economic systems that generated enormous wealth for those who orchestrated them while devastating the families and communities of their victims. The confiscation of property from condemned witches represented one of the most significant financial incentives driving persecution. Under the legal doctrine of forfeiture, all assets belonging to convicted witches automatically transferred to the prosecuting authorities. This included real estate, livestock, household goods, tools, money, and any other possessions of value. For many authorities, witch hunting became a lucrative form of legalized theft. The case of Wurzburg under Prince Bishop Julius Ector provides a stark example of how property confiscation could fund massive public works projects. The wealth seized from executed witches financed the construction of churches, palaces, fortifications, and other infrastructure throughout his territory. Accounting records from this period revealed that witch hunt revenues often exceeded traditional taxation, making persecution a more profitable form of governance than conventional administration. The scale of wealth transfer was staggering. In some regions, entire noble families were wiped out and their estates confiscated based on witchcraft accusations. The Franconian nobility, for example, lost numerous family lines during the intense persecutions of the early 17th century. These were not random acts of violence, but calculated campaigns, designed to redistribute wealth from established families to church and state authorities. Professional witch hunters operated according to clear financial incentives that encouraged the maximum number of prosecutions. Many worked on commission, receiving payment based on the number of witches they successfully identified and prosecuted. Others charged flat fees for their services, but these fees were often contingent on securing convictions. This payment structure created powerful incentives to find evidence of witchcraft regardless of its validity. The fee schedules for various aspects of which prosecution revealed the elaborate financial apparatus that supported these persecutions. Torturers received payment for each session, with higher rates for more complex procedures. Executioners charged different amounts depending on the method of execution, with burning typically commanding higher fees than hanging or beheading. Even minor functionaries, like guards and clerks, received compensation for their roles in the proceedings. The costs of imprisonment were typically charged to the families of the accused, creating additional financial pressure on victims and their relatives. These charges included fees for food, water, bedding, heating, and guard services. The longer a trial lasted, the greater these costs became, often bankrupting families even before final verdicts were reached. Some families found themselves forced to sell property or borrow money to pay for their relatives' imprisonment, creating additional economic hardship that could last for generations. The judicial system itself became a profit center through the various fees and fines associated with witch trials. Court clerks charged for recording testimony and maintaining documents. Judges received payments for presiding over cases. Legal advisors collected fees for their services, even though their advice typically favored prosecution over defense. Every aspect of the legal process generated revenue for someone involved in the system. The seasonal patterns of which persecution often correlated with economic cycles in local communities. Accusations frequently spiked during periods of economic hardship, when communities were struggling with failed harvests, livestock diseases, or other financial pressures. The confiscation of wealth from condemned witches provided a convenient solution to budget shortfalls, while the executions themselves served as scapegoating rituals that channeled economic frustration into religious violence. The international trade in witch hunting expertise reveals another economic dimension of these persecutions. Experienced inquisitors and professional witch hunters traveled from region to region, selling their services to local authorities. They brought with them not only knowledge of interrogation techniques and legal procedures, but also the equipment necessary for torture and execution. This created a mobile industry of persecution that could be deployed wherever demand existed. The equipment used in torture and execution represented significant capital investments that needed to be amortized. Across multiple cases, the construction of torture chambers, the purchase of specialized devices, and the maintenance of execution sites all required substantial upfront costs. This created economic pressure to use these facilities regularly, contributing to the systematic nature of persecution in regions that had invested heavily in witch hunting infrastructure. The publishing industry profited enormously from public fascination with witch trials. Books like the Malleus Maleficarum became bestsellers, going through numerous editions and translations. Pamphlets describing famous cases circulated widely, generating revenue for publishers while spreading the techniques and justifications for persecution. This created a feedback loop where successful prosecutions generated publicity that encouraged additional persecutions in other regions. The insurance industry, such as it existed in medieval and early modern Europe, also played a role in the economics of witch persecution. Merchants and property owners sought to protect themselves against losses attributed to witchcraft by purchasing various forms of protection. This might include payments to suspected witches to ensure their goodwill, donations to churches for protective prayers, or bribes to authorities to avoid suspicion. These protection payments represented a form of tribute extracted through fear rather than genuine spiritual services. The labor market effects of witch persecution were profound and long-lasting. The execution of skilled workers, particularly women involved in textile production, brewing, and other trades, created artificial scarcities that benefited surviving competitors. Male-dominated guilds sometimes used witchcraft accusations to eliminate female competition, consolidating control over lucrative trades that had previously been more gender-integrated. The credit and lending markets were severely disrupted by the unpredictability of witch accusations. Lenders became reluctant to extend credit to individuals who might be accused of witchcraft and have their assets confiscated. This created liquidity problems for local economies and made it more difficult for communities to respond to economic crises through traditional financial mechanisms. The agricultural implications were equally significant. The execution of rural women often disrupted traditional knowledge systems related to crop cultivation, animal husbandry, and seasonal planning. Many of these women possessed generations of accumulated wisdom about local growing conditions, weather patterns, and agricultural techniques. Their elimination created genuine economic losses that persisted long after the persecutions ended. The market for protective services flourished during periods of intense witch persecution. Individuals and families sought various forms of supernatural protection against accusations or actual witchcraft. This might include blessed amulets, protective prayers, ritual cleansings, or other services provided by clergy or folk practitioners. These markets represented attempts to commercialize spiritual security in an environment of pervasive fear, the taxation implications of which persecution extended beyond simple property confiscation. Communities that lost significant portions of their populations to execution faced reduced tax bases and increased per capita tax burdens for survivors. This created additional economic pressure that could trigger further waves of persecution as communities sought to blame their financial problems on remaining suspected witches. The inheritance patterns were fundamentally disrupted by witch persecution. Traditional systems of property transfer from parents to children were interrupted when entire families were executed or when surviving relatives were deemed unfit to inherit due to the taint of association with convicted witches. This created opportunities for more distant relatives, church authorities, or state officials to claim properties that would normally have remained within family lines. The impact on local trade networks was severe and long-lasting. Markets depended on relationships of trust and reputation that could be shattered by witch accusations. Merchants who were suspected of supernatural involvement found their business relationships severed, while those who remained were often reluctant to engage in transactions that might attract suspicion. The resulting disruption of commercial activity had cascading effects throughout regional economies. The financial records from regions that experienced intense witch persecution reveal the enormous scale of wealth redistribution involved in these campaigns. In some cases, the value of confiscated property exceeded the annual budgets of the prosecuting authorities, providing windfall revenues that funded years of administrative expansion and construction projects. These financial benefits created powerful constituencies for continued persecution long after the original religious and social justifications had lost their force. 7-year-old Johannes Junius stands trembling before the ecclesiastical court in Bamberg, his small hands bound with rope. The year is 1628, and this child, barely old enough to understand the concept of death, has been accused of attending sabbats where he supposedly danced with demons and learned to cast spells. His fate is already sealed. Within hours, he will be tortured until he confesses to crimes his young mind cannot even comprehend. And then he will be burned alive as a witch. The persecution of children represents perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the witch hunts, revealing the complete moral bankruptcy of the systems that enabled these atrocities. Children as young as 5 years old were accused, tortured, and executed for witchcraft across Europe. Their suffering exposes the true nature of witch persecution, not as a religious crusade against evil, but as a systematic campaign of terror that recognized no boundaries of age, innocence, or human decency. The legal framework that enabled the persecution of children was based on the belief that witchcraft could be hereditary or that demons could corrupt even the youngest souls. The Malleus Maleficarum argued that children could be taught witchcraft by their parents or seduced into demonic pacts by other witches. This theoretical foundation provided the justification for treating children as fully responsible agents capable of the most heinous supernatural crimes. The case of the Wurzburg children illustrates the systematic nature of child persecution during the height of the witch hunts. Between 1626 and 1631, Prince Bishop Julius Ector ordered the execution of numerous children, some as young as 7 years old. These children were accused of the same crimes as adults, including sexual relations with demons, attendance at saboots, and the use of malevolent magic against their neighbors. The torture of children followed the same brutal patterns used against adults, but with even more devastating psychological effects. Children subjected to the Strapado thumbscrews and other instruments of torture often suffered permanent physical damage that left them crippled for life, assuming they survived their ordeals. The psychological trauma was even more severe, as young minds struggled to comprehend the reasons for their suffering and the meaning of the confessions they were forced to make. The confessions extracted from children under torture provide chilling insights into how young minds processed the impossible situations they found themselves in. Many children, desperate to end their suffering, began to genuinely believe they had committed the crimes they were accused of. The line between reality and fantasy became blurred under the extreme stress of interrogation, leading some children to provide increasingly elaborate and detailed accounts of their supposed supernatural activities. The role of children as accusers proved equally devastating to communities and families. Young accusers were considered particularly credible witnesses because of their supposed innocence and inability to lie convincingly about complex supernatural matters. When children accused adults of witchcraft, their testimony carried enormous weight with authorities who viewed juvenile witnesses as pure vessels, incapable of the deception attributed to adult witches. The case of the Pendle witches in England demonstrates how children could be manipulated into condemning their own family members. 9-year-old Janet Device testified against her mother, brother, and sister, sending them all to their deaths. Her testimony was considered especially convincing precisely because of her youth, and her willingness to condemn her own relatives was seen as evidence of the supernatural threat posed by witchcraft, rather than as an indication of the corrupting influence of the legal proceedings themselves. The psychological manipulation of child witnesses and accusers reveals the sophisticated techniques employed by witch hunters to extract the testimony they needed. Children were isolated from their families, subjected to leading questions, promised rewards for cooperation, and threatened with punishment for refusing to testify. The resulting testimony often reflected the expectations and suggestions of their interrogators, rather than genuine experiences or observations. The seasonal patterns of child persecution often coincided with periods of social stress and economic hardship. Winter months, when families were confined together in small spaces and resources were scarce, frequently saw increases in accusations involving children. The psychological pressure of isolation and scarcity created conditions where family tensions could explode into supernatural accusations that destroyed entire households. The educational implications of child persecution were profound and long-lasting. The execution or traumatization of children disrupted traditional systems of knowledge transfer from older to younger generations. Skills, stories, and cultural practices that had been passed down through families for centuries were lost when entire lineages were eliminated or when surviving children were too traumatized to participate in normal, social, and educational activities. The gender patterns in child persecution mirrored those seen in adult cases, with girls facing higher rates of accusation and execution than boys. This reflected broader social attitudes about female susceptibility to demonic influence and the perceived threat posed by female autonomy and knowledge. Young girls who displayed intelligence, independence, or nonconformity were particularly vulnerable to accusations, especially in communities where traditional gender roles were being challenged. The family dynamics surrounding child persecution reveal the devastating impact these cases had on parental bonds and sibling relationships. Parents faced impossible choices between protecting their children and protecting themselves. Some parents abandoned or even accused their own children to avoid suspicion, while others sacrificed themselves in futile attempts to save their offspring. The medical understanding of childhood during the witch hunt period contributed to the vulnerability of young victims. Children's developmental stages were poorly understood, and behaviors that would now be recognized as normal aspects of growth and learning were often interpreted as signs of supernatural corruption. Night terrors, sleepwalking, imaginary friends, and other common childhood experiences could all be cited as evidence of demonic influence. The economic dimensions of child persecution followed the same patterns as adult cases, with the property of executed children typically being confiscated by prosecuting authorities. In some cases, children possessed significant inheritances or were heirs to valuable estates, making them attractive targets for those seeking to acquire wealth through legal confiscation. The economic incentives for persecution applied regardless of the victim's age. The international patterns of child persecution reveal how techniques and justifications developed in one region quickly spread to others. The Warburg model of systematic child persecution was copied in other German territories, while the English emphasis on child accusers influenced practices in colonial America. The exchange of information between witch hunters ensured that innovations in the persecution of children were rapidly disseminated throughout Europe and its colonies. The religious justifications for child persecution drew on biblical precedents and theological arguments about original sin and demonic corruption. Authorities cited scriptural passages about the corruption of human nature and the possibility of demonic possession to justify treating children as fully responsible moral agents capable of the most serious crimes. These theological arguments provided a veneer of intellectual respectability to what were fundamentally acts of child abuse and murder. The legal procedures used in child cases were typically identical to those used for adults, with few accommodations made for the victim's youth or psychological vulnerability. Children were subjected to the same interrogation techniques, torture methods, and trial procedures as their adult counterparts. The failure to recognize the special vulnerability of child defendants reflected the broader dehumanization that characterized witch persecution in general. The documentation of child cases provides some of the most disturbing records in the entire history of witch persecution. Detailed accounts of torture sessions involving children as young as 5 years old revealed a complete abandonment of basic human decency that characterized these proceedings. The bureaucratic precision with which these atrocities were recorded and justified demonstrates how systems of oppression can normalize even the most extreme forms of violence. The psychological impact on communities that witnessed the persecution of children was profound and lasting. The execution of young victims shattered assumptions about innocence and protection that are fundamental to social cohesion. Communities that participated in or tolerated the murder of children found themselves fundamentally transformed, with levels of trust and social solidarity that could take generations to rebuild. The resistance to child persecution, where it occurred, often came from the most unexpected sources. Some executioners refused to carry out death sentences against very young children risking their own positions and safety. Some judges found ways to delay or avoid child cases, hoping that changing political circumstances might provide opportunities for clemency. These acts of individual conscience, while ultimately insufficient to stop the persecution, provide glimpses of the moral revulsion that child victims could inspire even among those implementing the system. The legacy of child persecution during the witch hunts extends far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The systematic targeting of children for torture and execution represents one of humanity's most profound moral failures, demonstrating how ideological extremism can override the most basic protective instincts that normally shield the young from harm. These cases serve as particularly powerful warnings about the dangers of allowing fear and hatred to overcome reason and compassion in legal and political systems. Across the windswept moors of Scotland, through the dense forests of Germany, over the rolling hills of France, and into the colonial settlements of New England, a map of terror spreads like a plague across the landscape of early modern Europe and its colonies. But this map is not random. The witch hunts followed specific geographical patterns that revealed the political, economic, and social forces that drove these persecutions. Some regions became killing fields where thousands died, while neighboring areas remained relatively untouched. Understanding this geography of fear illuminates the true causes of witch persecution and exposes the calculated nature of what many have dismissed as mere superstitious hysteria. The Holy Roman Empire emerged as the epicenter of European witch persecution, accounting for an estimated 60% of all executions during the peak period between 1580 and 1650. This was not coincidence, but the result of specific political and legal conditions that made systematic persecution both possible and profitable. The empire's fragmented political structure, with hundreds of competing jurisdictions, created an environment where local rulers could implement extreme policies without effective oversight or restraint. The German territories of Franconia and Bavaria became particular hotbeds of persecution, with some regions losing significant percentages of their populations to witch hunts. The Prince-Bishopric of Würzburg alone saw approximately 1,000 executions between 1626 and 1631, while neighboring Bamberg witnessed similar levels of carnage. These were not spontaneous outbreaks of popular hysteria, but calculated campaigns orchestrated by ambitious clerical rulers, who used witch persecution to consolidate power and accumulate wealth. The border regions between Catholic and Protestant territories experienced particularly intense persecution, as competing religious authorities sought to demonstrate their orthodox piety and root out supernatural threats that might be linked to their religious opponents. The Rhine Valley, straddling multiple political and religious jurisdictions, became a corridor of death where accused witches could be pursued across territorial boundaries by determined prosecutors. In contrast, the centralized monarchies of Western Europe showed markedly different patterns of persecution. France, despite its reputation for religious conflict, actually had relatively restrained witch prosecution compared to the German territories. The strong central authority of the French monarchy, combined with the skeptical attitude of the Parliament of Paris toward witchcraft accusations, created institutional barriers that limited the scope and intensity of persecution. The geographical distribution of French witch trials reveals the importance of local political dynamics in determining persecution levels. Regions with weak royal authority or strong local noble power saw higher rates of prosecution, while areas under direct royal control experienced fewer trials and executions. The eastern frontier provinces, particularly Lorraine and Franche-Comté, witnessed intense persecution partly due to their contested political status and the competition between French royal authority and local noble traditions. Spain presents another contrasting model. where the Spanish Inquisition actually served as a moderating force on witch persecution, while the Inquisition is often portrayed as an engine of persecution. Its centralized structure and standardized procedures actually created barriers to the kind of local witch-hunting frenzies that devastated other parts of Europe. The Spanish Inquisition required higher standards of evidence for witchcraft prosecutions and was generally skeptical of mass accusations and claims of widespread supernatural conspiracies. The Italian states showed varied patterns depending on their political structures and relationship to papal authority. The papal states themselves had relatively few witch executions, possibly due to the sophisticated theological and legal expertise available in Rome. However, the northern Italian territories controlled by various princes and republics experienced more intense persecution, particularly during periods of political instability or external threat. England's experience with witch persecution was shaped by its unique legal system and political development. The English common law tradition required higher standards of evidence than the inquisitorial procedures used on the continent, creating some protection against the worst excesses of persecution. However, specific regions and time periods saw intense witch-hunting activity, particularly during the English Civil War, when traditional legal restraints broke down. The East Anglian witch hunts of the 1640s, led by self-proclaimed witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins, demonstrate how political chaos could unleash local persecution campaigns. Hopkins exploited the breakdown of central authority during the Civil War to conduct systematic witch hunts across Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk, and surrounding counties. His methods, including sleep deprivation, forced walking, and the search for supernatural marks on victims' bodies, resulted in more executions than had occurred in the previous century of English witch prosecution. Scotland presents a particularly complex case, where intense persecution occurred despite the country's relatively centralized political structure. The Scottish witch hunts were driven by a combination of religious reformist zeal, political insecurity, and the personal obsessions of King James VI. The North Berwick witch trials of 1590-1591 set a precedent for systematic persecution that continued intermittently for over a century. The geographical distribution of Scottish witch trials reveals the importance of local kirk sessions and presbyteries in driving persecution. These religious courts had extensive authority over moral and supernatural matters, and their decentralized structure allowed local prejudices and conflicts to escalate into formal accusations. The Highland regions, with their different cultural traditions and weaker kirk influence, experienced significantly lower levels of persecution than the lowlands. The colonial extension of European witch persecution into the New World reveals how these patterns of fear and violence could be transplanted to entirely different geographical and cultural contexts. The Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 represent the most famous example of colonial witch persecution, but similar outbreaks occurred throughout European colonial settlements in the Americas. The geographical factors that contributed to the Salem outbreak included the community's frontier location, internal disputes over land and religious authority, and tensions between different social and economic groups. The initial accusations emerged from the household of Samuel Parris, the village minister, and spread through networks of family, neighborhood, and religious connections that mapped onto the social geography of Salem village and its surrounding communities. The Scandinavian countries experienced witch persecution, but with distinct characteristics shaped by their political structures and cultural traditions. Denmark-Norway saw significant persecution during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, with particular intensity in regions experiencing economic hardship or social conflict. Sweden had a more restrained approach to witch prosecution, partly due to the influence of legal scholars who were skeptical of witchcraft accusations. The Eastern European territories present complex patterns of persecution influenced by the region's religious diversity, political fragmentation, and cultural traditions. Poland-Lithuania, with its mixture of Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox populations, experienced varied levels of persecution depending on local circumstances. The presence of different legal traditions and religious authorities created a patchwork of persecution intensity across the region. The urban-rural divide, in which persecution reveals important social and economic factors that influenced accusation patterns. Rural areas generally experienced higher rates of persecution than urban centers, possibly due to stronger traditional beliefs about magic and supernatural causation in agricultural communities. However, major cities could also become sites of intense persecution when political or religious authorities decided to make examples of urban witches. The seasonal geography of which persecution shows how climate and agricultural cycles influenced accusation patterns. Northern regions with harsh winters often saw accusations spike during the dark months when communities were isolated and resources scarce. Coastal areas might experience persecution waves following storms or fishing disasters that were attributed to supernatural causes. Agricultural regions frequently saw accusations coincide with crop failures or livestock diseases. The transportation networks that connected different regions also influenced the spread of persecution techniques and ideologies. River valleys, mountain passes, and major trade routes served as corridors along which hunting expertise, legal procedures, and demonological theories could travel. The same networks that carried commercial goods also transmitted the knowledge and personnel that made systematic persecution possible. The linguistic geography of persecution reveals additional patterns related to cultural transmission and political authority. Regions sharing common languages or dialects often showed similar persecution patterns, as legal texts, trial procedures, and demonological treatises could be easily shared. The translation of key texts, like the Malleus Maleficarum, into vernacular languages facilitated the spread of persecution techniques across linguistic boundaries. The military geography of early modern Europe also influenced which persecution patterns. Regions experiencing warfare or military occupation often saw increased persecution, as communities sought explanations for their suffering and authorities sought to maintain control through demonstrations of power. The passage of armies could spread persecution techniques and personnel across wide geographical areas, contributing to the international character of the witch hunts.